His cries could be heard in 3 inner courtyards of the palace. Deaf blows, the clanging of locks, and a shrill "No!" rang out in the narrow passageway as the eunuchs held the young man down and the executioner cut into his flesh. Blood gushed into a copper basin, and the severed member, still warm, fell into a rag that a servant hastily clenched in his fist. Thus began the execution of the heir, which the Sultan himself had ordered to be carried out as a political punishment. The chronicles wrote that the day was marked by a special stench. The chamber was filled with the iron smell of blood and the acrid smoke of tar, which was used to cauterize the severed flesh so that the young man would not die immediately. He was left to live without his manhood, humiliated and useless, put on display as an example to others. The servants were ordered to write. The member was cut off by the will of the ruler in order to intimidate and prevent treason. The Sultan was still powerful at the time, but illness was already in his veins. Witnesses noted that the ruler's face had become earthen, his lips were cracked, and his urine smelled of rot. He suffered from pain in his lower abdomen and ulcers on his legs that festered and would not heal. Doctors prescribed bloodletting in small portions 3 times a week, 1 bowl at a time. Leeches were placed on his neck and under his knees for a quarter of an hour, but the inflammation only intensified. Cauterization was performed on specific points on his thigh in the hope of stopping the spread of the abscesses. Ointments made from lard and crushed garlic were rubbed in 3 times a day, but the skin darkened and fell off in flakes. In the mornings, he was given a pinch of opium powder, and at night, 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup. The chronicles note that the stench in the chambers was so bad that the guards were changed every 2 hours. Servants whispered that the cruelty towards his son was not only caused by suspicion of treason. The Sultan was told that the young man had entered into secret negotiations with influential emissaries from Persia and was ready to support reformers who opposed his father's cruel policies. The old family saw the boy as a hope for leniency, but the Sultan's new entourage demanded execution. The cutting off of a limb was chosen as a symbol. The heir was deprived not only of the opportunity to continue the family line, but also of the very sign of power, since the penis was considered a sign of male strength and the right to the throne. The medical records from those weeks contain strange details. The Sultan's pulse was described as rare and irregular, his tongue as gray with a coating, and his urine as thick with sediment and a pungent odor. He sweated constantly, and his underwear was changed every half day. Felt pads were placed on the bed, and straps were tied under his back to prevent him from rolling over in his delirium. The senior eunuch's report noted, "There are cracks in his heels that bleed, festering sores on his shins. An abscess has burst on his thigh, and the stench has become unbearable." Every day, the Sultan demanded that his son be brought to him so that he could see his suffering. The young man, barely alive after losing so much blood, lay in a separate cell, and the eunuchs reported that he was moaning and losing consciousness. But the Sultan insisted that the heir be given bitter infusions and kept alive, so that no one would doubt that he had been castrated, humiliated, and broken. The court records contain the following entry: "The son is alive but weakening. The ruler smiles, saying that he will never touch a woman or father a rival." Fear of God's judgment increasingly overwhelmed the Sultan at night. He summoned imams, demanding long confessions. He asked whether Allah would forgive someone who ordered the castration of his own son. He was promised alms and prayers for the repose of his soul if he distributed gold to the poor and freed some of the prisoners. But the Sultan hesitated. In the morning, he would order mercy, and in the evening, he would sign death warrants. Doctors noted that his delirium intensified during those days. He saw limbless hands reaching out to him. The guards around his chambers changed daily. Old families demanded their people at the doors, but the Sultan's new entourage imposed eunuchs and bodyguards. Lists of those allowed access were redrafted every evening, and only the Grand Vizier held the keys to the inner doors. Reports from Venetian ambassadors noted that access to the Sultan's body had become restricted, and that negotiations about the future throne were already being conducted in secret in neighboring halls. Doctors continued to record, "His complexion is ashen, his breathing is heavy, his breath smells foul, his ulcers are covered with scabs, but they open again." Compresses of wormwood decoction were applied to his feet for an hour, changed every half hour, but pus seeped through the rags. At dawn, the Sultan was given a pinch of opium, but the pain returned at noon. The guards complained that he was screaming in his sleep and calling his son by name, demanding that his penis be cut off again, as if he had not yet been punished. Later reports wrote, "This was the beginning of the end." The disease took hold, the ulcers multiplied, the body rotted, but power remained in his hands. The Sultan ordered executions, distributed land, and interrogated ambassadors, even though his speech was slurred and his gaze wandered. No one dared to contradict him, for the fear of what he had done to his son lived in everyone. The smell from his chambers could now be smelled in the corridor, long before reaching the doors. Servants, accustomed to the stench of blood and pus, covered their faces with felt before entering. But even so, they felt dizzy. The Sultan lay on his back, his body swollen, the skin on his stomach yellow and blotchy. The doctors noted that he was now urinating with difficulty, with blood clots and a thick sediment resembling chalk dust. The ulcers on his legs had spread, and pus dripped onto the felt, soaking the floor, so copper trays were placed under the bed and taken out of the palace twice a day. The procedures continued endlessly. Bloodletting was reduced to twice a week, but they still took half a cup at a time. Leeches were placed on his temples and behind his ears for a quarter of an hour at a time in an attempt to reduce the fever. At night, the Sultan was given 2 spoonfuls of poppy syrup, and during the day, a pinch of opium. Wormwood compresses were changed every half hour, but the cloth became soaked with pus, and the smell only grew worse. Cauterization was performed on his feet to stop the spread of black spots, but the skin cracked and fell off in flakes. Political life in the palace was in turmoil around his bed. The old families insisted that the son, even though he had been deprived of his manhood, still had a right to the throne. The new entourage argued that the heir could no longer be ruler, for without a penis he was humiliated and unworthy of continuing the line. Secret negotiations with the ambassadors of the Ottoman Porte and the Venetians were held at night, and the guards were changed every 4 hours. The Grand Vizier personally checked the locks on the doors and the keys, trusting no one. The Sultan himself fell into fits of rage. He demanded that his son be brought to his bed, forced everyone to look at his deformity, and repeat that the heir was unworthy. The young man was kept alive, although his wound had long since festered, and he could hardly move. The eunuch's report said, "The son is alive, but the smell from his wound has become unbearable." The Sultan ordered leeches to be placed on him, and the wound to be burned with resin, so that he would continue to suffer. At night he raved. He screamed that he saw severed limbs laid out on silver trays. He asked the imams to pray for him, but after confession, he again gave orders for executions. The priests wrote, "He doubts whether God will forgive him, for he has taken not only the flesh, but also the honor of his son." In the morning, he promised to distribute gold to the poor, and in the evening, he ordered 3 viziers to be imprisoned for alleged treason. Medical records preserved the details. His tongue was dry and gray, his breathing was heavy, and his breath smelled of decay. Sweat poured from him in streams, and his sheets were changed 3 times a day. His heels were cracked and bleeding to the bone. An ulcer had opened under his stomach, oozing a dark liquid. The doctors wrote, "The fever is not subsiding, his pulse is weak, his breathing is hoarse." They understood that the disease was getting out of control, but were afraid to say so out loud. Political intrigues were thickening. Ambassadors from neighboring powers demanded clarity. Who would be the heir? The old families tried to save the life of the castrated son, hoping to use him as a puppet. The Sultan's new entourage pushed to declare the son incapacitated and appoint a new heir from their own ranks. Venetian reports say there are now two camps inside the palace, and both fear each other. Meanwhile, the Sultan was choking on the pain more and more. They tied straps around his chest and stomach to keep him from tearing open his own sores in his sleep. His lips were covered with black scabs, his breathing became hoarse, and his tongue barely moved. But even in this condition, he tried to dictate new decrees, ordering the execution of imaginary enemies and the confiscation of land from the old nobility. His voice broke, but his words were written down and carried out. Rumors about his condition spread throughout the capital. People whispered that the Sultan was cursed for cutting off his son's member. They prayed in mosques for Allah to take his soul quickly. But death did not come, and the ruler continued to rot in his bed, maintaining his iron grip on power, even though he could not rise from his bed. The stench from his chambers became so strong that even the guards in the corridor stood with their faces covered with woolen bandages, soaked in vinegar. The servants no longer wanted to go inside. Changing the bedding was accompanied by vomiting and fainting. The Sultan's body was decomposing while he was still alive. The skin on his hands was blackened with spots. His nails began to peel off, and his eyes were constantly cloudy. His breathing became intermittent, with wheezing, as if he were drowning. The doctors recorded his condition every day. In the morning, his pulse was rare, barely perceptible, his tongue gray and covered with cracks. He hardly urinated at all. In the morning, it was thick, black, and smelled of sulfur. Bloodletting was now done in small portions, a quarter of a cup every other day, but the blood was thick and dark, like tar. Leeches were applied to his stomach and neck, but they fell off prematurely. The skin was too rotten. Cauterization was performed on the thigh, where a new abscess had opened, but the tissue only cracked and charred. By dawn, the opiate potions no longer brought relief, and the Sultan moaned until noon when he fell into a stupor. He continued to call for his sons, demanding that his castrated heir be brought to him. Each time he saw the mutilated young man, he shouted that his son's penis had been cut off according to the law, and demanded that the viziers confirm the inadmissibility of his rights to the throne. The eunuch said that the heir himself was lying in another wing with a swollen, festering wound, and could no longer stand up. His body stank no less than his father's. Doctors noted, the son's tissues are dead, the scabs are covered with worms. But the Sultan insisted that the young man be dragged to his bed so that everyone could see that the humiliation had been accomplished and that power no longer belonged to this body. An open split began in the palace. The old families demanded that the bloodline be preserved through the castrated heir. They said, the member has been cut off, but the Sultan's blood still flows in him. The new entourage argued that a man without a member could not be a husband or father, and therefore could not be Sultan. A report by the Venetian ambassadors stated, some say he is legitimate, others that he is dead to the dynasty. Secret meetings were held at night in the dark halls of the palace. Supporters of the two camps changed the guards at the doors, each trying to bribe the doctors so that they would be the first to declare death and read the will. Meanwhile, the Sultan himself sank deeper and deeper into delirium. Sometimes he saw severed limbs thrown into the fire, sometimes women in black veils holding silver bowls of blood. He cried out that his soul wouldn't be forgiven and demanded confession every evening. The imams recorded, he swears to give away his gold, but in the morning he orders the execution of 3 of his closest associates. The fear of God's judgment struggled within him with his thirst for power. His servants noted that by the end of the 3rd month, he could barely hold his head up. His eyes were inflamed, his eyelids were stuck together with pus, and he had almost lost his sight. His lips were cracked and bleeding. Sores appeared on his cheeks, oozing a yellow liquid. The skin on his legs became like tree bark, with black cracks reaching deep into the flesh. His servants lifted him up to turn him over, but his back was already covered with festering sores. His sheets had to be changed 5 times a day. With each passing day, people turned away from him more and more. Even the viziers began to come only when necessary, writing down his instructions from a distance. His voice turned into a wheeze, but every word still had the force of law. He ordered his will to be rewritten, one version yesterday, another today. The old families insisted that he leave everything to his son, but his new entourage dictated the names of their own people. Sometimes the Sultan himself forgot what he had said the day before, and accused the scribes of lying. The guards were now changed every hour. The chief eunuch held the keys, but at night armed groups from different families appeared in the corridors. They feared that the Sultan's death would be announced prematurely, or that his body would be hidden. From reports, on the night of the 24th to the 25th, people from the Kamal clan broke into the chambers. They were driven out, but the quarrel turned into a fight. People in the city whispered that the Sultan would rot alive for cutting off his own son's member. They said that a curse would fall on his dynasty. In the mosques, they prayed for his speedy death, but rumors that he was still breathing spread fear. He continued to live, although he already looked like a corpse. Every day he was lifted up with straps, wiped with rags, and his wounds were smeared with a mixture of vinegar, honey, and ash. But the smell grew stronger, and the doctors wrote, "The body is decomposing. Perfumes are of no use." The Sultan could no longer see who was entering his chambers. His eyes were clouded over, his eyelids were swollen, and the light irritated them painfully. His movements became sharp and involuntary. His hands pushed the air away, as if trying to grasp something invisible. His voice turned into a wheeze, but his commands sounded like a judgment. "Bring him. Bring my son. Check the will." The eunuchs and viziers wrote down every word, afraid to make a mistake and become victims themselves. Ulcers covered most of his body. The skin on his back and chest had turned black and peeled off in layers, and his thighs and stomach were covered with festering sores filled with dark pus. Sweat poured down in streams, mixing with the remains of ointments and opium syrup. Blood flowed incessantly from small cracks, and even bloodletting brought no relief. Leeches were applied to his neck and knees, but the skin was too damaged. Cauterization of specific points on the palms and soles only intensified the smell of decay. The doctor wrote, "Breathing is rare. Pulse is barely palpable. Tongue is dry and cracked. Urine is thick with sediment." The servants were now afraid to even approach him. When they lifted him to change the sheets, they saw his body sagging, pieces of skin falling off, and worms crawling out of his wounds. The sheets were changed every 2 hours. Felt pads were soaked with pus. Rags were moistened with vinegar and salt. But the stench remained unbearable. The political struggle reached its climax. Old families tried to have the castrated son recognized as heir. They claimed that although his member had been cut off, the Sultan's blood still flowed in him, and he retained his power. The new entourage, on the contrary, insisted on recognizing the new heir, considering the son physically incapacitated. In the corridors of the palace, there were fights between groups of guards, changes of viziers, and checks of keys by eunuchs. Ambassadors from neighboring powers held negotiations, trying to understand who was really in charge, and who was merely holding on to power through force of habit and fear. The Sultan was delirious, seeing severed limbs on trays, and hearing the whispers of his sons and viziers who were falsifying his will. He swore that he would punish all those who betrayed his will, and ordered confessions at night, promising alms to the poor. But every morning his orders became incoherent, and his power gradually slipped away. His entourage hardly spoke to him anymore. The viziers came only to record his orders. The old families whispered about his heir, and his new entourage planned a change of power. Reports noted that his presence had become merely symbolic, but fear of him kept the court in check. His body was deteriorating rapidly. Sweat, blood, pus, and ointments mixed into a caustic slurry. His pulse was weak, his breathing was labored, and his tongue was covered with a gray crust. Lying in bed, the Sultan could barely move his fingers, but he still demanded that his castrated son be brought to him, that executions be carried out, and that land be distributed. Straps held him in place so he wouldn't fall out of bed. Felt pads and rags soaked in vinegar and salt tried to absorb the stench, but it permeated the corridors. At night, he screamed that he saw traitors and his son, who had been deprived of his manhood. He called for imams, demanded prayers, but his delirium intensified. The eunuchs noted, every sound causes horror. The Sultan himself is frightening, even though his body is almost a corpse. Old families were afraid to approach, and his new entourage secretly corresponded about inheritance and wills. The people outside the palace walls whispered that the Sultan would rot alive, that he had been punished by a higher power for cutting off his son's penis. In the mosques, they prayed for his soul, but fear of his living body, exuding death, kept the city in terror. The Sultan saw no one anymore. His eyes were covered with a cloudy film, his eyelids were swollen, his body movements became meaningless, and his breathing was rare and intermittent. His tongue was completely dry, his lips were cracked and bleeding, and a persistent smell of decay emanated from his mouth. The skin on his hands, chest, and stomach was completely blackened and peeling, and new boils had opened on his thighs, oozing a dark, purulent fluid. Sweat poured down in streams, mixing with ointments, opium, and the remains of blood, and the smell spread through the corridors. The sheets and blankets were changed every 2 hours, but they were soaked with pus and mucus, and the smell was unbearable. His body was almost motionless. Straps held him to the bed to prevent him from falling off. The doctors were still checking his pulse, breathing, tongue color, and urine, although they knew that his body had given up. Opium and poppy syrup no longer brought relief, and cauterization of his palms and feet only intensified the pain. The leeches fell off on their own. The skin was too damaged. The open sores on his legs and stomach were infested with worms, and mucus oozed out, making it difficult for the servants to touch him without feeling nauseous. The Sultan continued to rave. He saw severed limbs on silver trays, and heard the whispers of his sons and viziers, who were supposedly faking his will. He screamed that his soul would not be forgiven, and ordered his castrated son to be brought before him, so that he could be humiliated again and again. The eunuchs wrote down every word, afraid to make a mistake. The old families tried to prove their son's right to the throne, while the new entourage secretly corresponded about the inheritance and the will. The palace corridors had now become an arena of struggle. The sides changed guards every hour, checked keys and locks, and made nightly rounds. Ambassadors from neighboring countries watched from the sidelines, trying to understand who really held power and who was merely a symbol. Old families insisted on preserving the bloodline, while the new entourage demanded that a new heir be recognized. The vizier's reports noted, fear of the Sultan's body keeps the court in check, but power is gradually slipping away. Finally, the day came when the Sultan's body gave up. His breathing stopped, his pulse disappeared, his eyes closed, and his tongue was covered with a thick gray crust. The straps were removed, and the body no longer moved. The sheets and trays were carried outside, and the corridor was filled with an unusual silence. The eunuchs and viziers stood, not daring to touch him, afraid to touch the rotting body. The political consequences followed immediately. Old families and the new entourage began to divide power, arguing over the heir and the will. The castrated son was declared incompetent and left in a separate cell. A new sultan was chosen from among the closest relatives supported by the palace entourage. Reports from ambassadors stated, the sultan's inheritance proved to be a stumbling block. Blood and honor did not save his son. The city and the palace were filled with fear and superstition. The people saw the sultan's death as punishment for cruelty. The cutting off of his son's member became a symbol of retribution. People prayed for peace in the mosques, but they were afraid of the living shadows that remained in the chambers. Priests and imams wrote in their chronicles, his sins and sufferings will remain in the memory of the people. The sultan's death was a lesson to all who seek to hold power through cruelty. Thus ended the life of a ruler who, until the last moment, tried to control everything around him, maintaining fear and power at the same time, but whose physical and moral decay turned him into a terrible shadow of his own will. After his death, chaos engulfed the palace. A struggle for the throne, intrigues, rewriting of wills, and feuds between the old and new nobility marked the beginning of a new era of power based on fear and calculation.